My name is Elizabeth Prodromou. I am a professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I'm happy to be welcoming all of you to our Cultural Heritage in Crisis conversation series. This series is being co-sponsored by the Initiative on Religion, Law and Diplomacy at the Fletcher School, along with the Foreign Affairs Institute in Athens, Greece. And we will be spending the next week and a half in a 5-part series that looks at the issue of cultural heritage in the current context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Before we begin, I want to thank you all for joining, all of you who are online with us today. And I also want to thank our two speakers, Dr. Marios Nottas from the European Communication Institute in Athens, and Professor Bonnie Dougherty at Harvard Law School, who directs the International Human Rights Clinic there. I'll come back to introduce our speakers more fully in a moment, but I want to offer a couple of other thank yous. First of all, to Brad Maycumber, who is online with us, who is the Fletcher technology genius who's making all of this possible, and also to Francois Venet and CC Rosenman. Francois, who is part of the leadership team for the Initiative on Religion, Law and Diplomacy, the student club leadership team, and CC Rosenman, who is interning with us in the initiative and the club. And both of them have done yeoman's work in making this series possible. Over the next week and a half, I'll be co-moderating our panels with Mr. Lukas Katsonis, who is the president of the Foreign Affairs Institute in Athens. And we have 5 separate sessions. You've received the links for all of those, so we hope you'll join us with all of them. But I'd like to just give you a moment of background on the logic of this series at this particular point in time. The world has been, of course, changed and focused on the COVID-19 pandemic. And with the focus on the pandemic, we may tend to think that some other activities and some other issues are frozen and have stopped. But what we know is that notwithstanding the devastating effects of the coronavirus crisis, which have also reminded us of our connection and our solidarity as human beings, we've seen terms like commonality, university, integrity, solidarity, the connection between the local and the global. We also know that within the cultural heritage space, things have not frozen. And in fact, there's a lot happening on the ground around the world when it comes to the protection, the preservation, and the sustainability of cultural heritage, and cultural heritage as world heritage. So the pandemic in many ways gives us an opportunity to reflect on cultural heritage at a time of momentous global and historical change. So having said that, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Make note of one change. The change is that Dr. Athanasios Dimopoulos, who is the rector of the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, he will also be participating, but he's going to actually participate with a message on our 4th panel, which will occur on the 20th of June. So you'll have an opportunity to hear from him on the June 20th panel. So with no further ado, let me introduce our 2 speakers today. Welcome you and thank you from your respective places in Maine and in Athens, Greece. Dr. Bonnie Dougherty, Professor Bonnie Dougherty, who is Associate Director of Armed Conflict and Civilian Protection and a lecturer on law at the International Human Rights Clinic at the Harvard Law School. She actually founded and directs the clinic's Armed Conflict and Civilian Protection Initiative. And she's also a senior researcher in the Arms Division of Human Rights Watch, and she is a cultural heritage expert. So welcome, Professor Docherty. It's great to have you with us. And then also we have Dr. Marios Nottas, who's with us. He is a communication scientist focusing on the digital arts and landscapes. He also does a lot of work on European identity, communications and technology. And by training, he's actually a sociologist who did his work at Boston University. He now serves as an executive member of the board of the European Communication Institute. The institute is actually based in Vienna. So it's a pleasure to have you both with us. And I would like to welcome you each to begin with an introductory statement about our panel today. Why does cultural heritage matter for humanity? And maybe we can ask you, Bonnie, to begin.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and I want to thank the organizers of this event, both at Fletcher School and the Foreign Affairs Institute in Greece. It's great to be part of the first panel of a series on a very interesting and timely topic. So in my opening remarks, I want to briefly offer a definition of cultural heritage, and then I address the main title of this panel, the main question in the title of this panel: why does cultural heritage matter for humanity? The short answer is that there's a whole range of reasons. I'll highlight 6, but many of them intersect with each other. International law, which is where I come from, is define cultural heritage in numerous ways. And one reason for the gaps in protection is due to the differences in treaties' definitions. For the purposes of this discussion, I'll be defining it broadly and borrowing from a number of different treaties. Types of cultural heritage include individual objects, such as movable objects, for example, works of art, books, manuscripts, as well as immovable objects, buildings, large sculptures, cave paintings, etc. It can include groups of buildings that have value as a collective, such as historic city centers, or sites, such as archaeological sites. It can also include museums, libraries, and facilities that house cultural heritage, particularly the movable works. And more recently, it's been understood to include intangible heritage, things like music and dance and folklore. These types of objects can be important for a variety of reasons. Treaties often cite their historic, religious, artistic, archaeological, or scientific significance in order to warrant their protection. And many treaties, for example, the 1972 World Heritage Convention and the 1954 Hague Convention, narrow their definitions to focus on objects of, quote, universal value or of value to every people. But that said, it's important to note that cultural heritage can also be worth protecting if it has a more local value. And so that question of universal and local is important in this discussion. And finally, just note that although personal significance alone may not elevate a piece of culture to world heritage, it is worth noting that many examples of cultural heritage have personal meaning and memories for individuals. So however it is defined, cultural heritage is of value to humanity for numerous reasons. As I said, I will break it down into 6 categories. First, preserving and studying cultural heritage advances knowledge. It helps the contemporary world understand the history and evolution of human accomplishments over time, and in turn provides context for one's own time. The history can directly link to one's own culture or relate to an earlier one. For example, the Roman and Byzantine ruins in Syria are significant in part, although probably not exclusively, because of what they reveal about ancient civilizations. And these civilizations are distinct for the most part from the current culture of Syria, even though they are provided historic foundations for many cultures in the Western world. Second, cultural heritage also relates to contemporary experience. People may value buildings ranging from the Parthenon to the Empire State Building because they admire their aesthetics or marvel at their achievement. Churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, and other similar structures can also be essential to ongoing religious or spiritual practices. Third, in many cases, heritage is closely tied to cultural identity. It serves as a link to a cultural past, an expression of a culture's contemporary life. This quality, unfortunately, can endanger cultural heritage. In times of genocide and ethnic cleansing, perpetrators may destroy such symbols of identity in an effort to wipe out a culture. In the Holocaust, for example, Nazis destroyed synagogues and looted cultural objects owned by Jewish families. The fourth category is that cultural heritage unites people, whether locally or across the globe. The bridge at Mostar in Bosnia-Herzegovina exemplifies this ability to bring people together. The bridge was built in 1566 by an Ottoman Turkish architect, and its destruction by the Croatian army in 1993 was mourned internationally and locally. The historic landmark was an artistic treasure and a scientific achievement which was admired by people around the world. It also bridged, both literally and figuratively, different groups who lived in Mostar, served as a symbol of a shared culture that transcended ethnic lines, and has provided evidence of coexistence before a civil war which was infamous for its examples of ethnic cleansing. Fifth, on a more practical note, cultural heritage can have economic value, particularly at the community level. Museums, famous buildings, and archaeological sites attract local, national, and international tourists, and tourism brings in money that is often crucial to the local economy. Furthermore, community members are often hired to either work at sites or to protect them. And finally, cultural heritage helps humans place themselves in time. It reminds people of their mortality because it can last long beyond the individuals who made or appreciated it. Rather than belonging to one generation, cultural heritage can be seen as a gift to pass on to future generations. At the same time, it is vulnerable, and humans often find its destruction devastating. A Croatian author writing about the Mostar Bridge, I mentioned a minute ago, noted that while we expect people to die, quote, the destruction of a monument to civilization is something else. She explained, quote, the bridge in all its beauty and grace was built to outlive us. It was an attempt to grasp eternity. Because it was the product of both individual creativity and collective experience, it transcended our individual destiny. A dead woman is one of us, but the bridge is all of us forever. So with that, just sort of laying out some brief remarks, I'll pass it back to Elizabeth, but look forward to our questions and answer session shortly.
Thank you, Bonnie. That was wonderful. Let me turn to Mario now and ask you also to offer some initial thoughts as well.
Give me 1 second. Very good. Okay. I was looking at your opening statement, Professor Prodromou, and I mentioned what you have there about asking us to reflect on the interconnectedness of humanity, and I believe this is the key term. We have been asked to contribute with our thoughts and definitions of cultural heritage within this framework, combined with our perspective of the COVID-19 crisis. So this is quite a challenge. I'll try my best. I will take it a little slower than planned. As I understand, we do have more time than originally allocated. I would like to ask our students not to take notes unless they want to just ask something when we're done. Hopefully we will make these presentations available to you later on. So definitions. I think cultural heritage is double-faceted. As anywhere in the world, as also Bonnie also mentioned, it has both a local dimension and a global dimension. The local one is, as well known, closely linked with local traits such as climate, natural resources, local norms and mores, as they in turn, here's a sociologist speaking in me, dear Elizabeth, which of course in turn are produced and are affected by diverse lands, by diverse physical traits, diverse races, diverse places, diverse circumstances. This is the local dimension of cultural heritage. But there's also a global dimension which emphasizes universal values, which can vary. It can be respect for the elderly, it can be protection of motherhood, it can be cooperation in the production of goods, which is an economic aspect. And also, very importantly, as we're going to be focusing on this, reward for art. And in some cases, not all civilizations, a global dimension is tolerance. It does exist in many cultures. Cultural heritage can be better understood when regarded as carrier of information. This is a communication scientist's approach. It's more than that. It's a carrier of the aroma of information, which is information. This is a poetic definition. Aroma is information in its most dense form. As such, it can address itself not just at the more volatile and vulnerable to new information parts of memory, but rather to that which genetists frequently refer to as genetic or generational memory. We can think of a dense information bank, we're still talking about cultural heritage, which seems to reside at the most impressionable and most inaccessible by everyday demands part of the human brain. This is the neuroscientist's approach. These information sets have also been evidence to hold information which is not conventionally acquired during one's lifetime. As such, at times of crisis, like the current one, the one we're undergoing, these sets of information can be very, very important. We can talk about deep data. This deep data seems to add up and develop such traits of our evolution, like our capacity to appreciate art. Think about it. The more evolved we are, the more demanding we seem to be in the ways that we assimilate, enjoy, and even produce art. And the art seems to be in the heart of what we generically refer to as cultural heritage, as Bonnie also emphasized. Once again, I'll be poetic. Cultural heritage is the carrier of the aroma of our existence and the vehicle for self-definition as honorary members of a very exclusive culture club. A culture club that sometimes uses mundane member criteria and sometimes uses metaphysical ones, i.e. religious ones. This culture club that each one of us belongs to educates and provides us with tools for perceiving and enjoying, among others, visual art, performing art, hybrid art, you name it. It's a both inherited and acquired capacity, of course, which affects us in all the ways that we perceive ourselves as gods or as ants, as units or as collectivities, as egoists or as altruists. This shared skill acts like a kind of a social glue and involves our facilities to understand and appreciate the Greek Inios, the marvels of Roman architecture, the Renaissance paintings, or even the complexities of popular music of the 60s. Our common capacity for this sort of appreciation determines two things: our cultural coherence through time, for example, assuring local identity and preserving it, i.e. cultural continuity and so on. This is through time, but also our cultural coherence at any one time. For example, holding societies together, and most importantly, the sociologist's perspective again, keeping societies in sync. And keeping societies in sync is also directly related to production, which is also very important. In times of crisis, this aroma, I can refer to just three examples. The ceremony of the lighting of the Olympic flame, the switch of a global monument into a mono-religious temple. Of course, I'm referring to Hagia Sophia and current news. And in times of crisis, this aroma, in the case of the development of pandemic policies in a semi-federal environment like the European Union, in all of these cases, this aroma is decisive. In all of these examples, for better or worse, it takes a consensus in the form of a prominent global stand, or if you like, a shared beyond the border culture to come to a choice of action. In all these three examples, we need to choose action. And in order to choose the right action, we need some kind of consensus, what I call a prominent global stand, in order to make this choice the right one. Concerning cultural heritage in the pandemic, my regard and wonder is double-faceted as well. On the one hand, I regard the pandemic as acting in two opposite directions. I will come back to this. On the other hand, I regard the pandemic and its cultural byproducts as an offered wonderful opportunity. Again, I'll come back to that. Let's look at the two opposite directions of the pandemic. Of course, it's self-explanatory. It brings up, it showcases the commonalities, among them the vulnerability of the global citizen. Therefore, it creates a new kind of belonging, and it proves that there is need of a planetary level of solidarity. This is a very practical level, but it's very important. This is the one direction. On the other, which is the opposite, it enhances the divide. It engraves deeper borders of all sorts. For example, safe and unsafe neighborhoods, safe and unsafe regions, safe and unsafe countries, even continents. Within Greece, I can give you an example. We repeatedly witnessed this in the case of attitudes, both within and towards the Roma, the Gypsies, and the refugees, both in how they handled this information and this crisis, and how we handled this situation and their deviance, so to say. What a wonderful, yes?
I'm jumping in, okay, as every good academic would do. I want to give you and Professor Docherty enough time to talk to each other.
Yes.
So can we move forward as you conclude your introduction?
I am concluding. Actually, I'm on the concluding statement.
Wonderful. Okay. Fantastic. Okay. All right. Okay.
All right. So I was about to say that this is a wonderful opportunity, and this is what we call. Why again? Because something needs to be done, and we called it. Our approach is what we call the citizen literacy approach. CITLIT, or citizen literacy, is a policy concept co-developed by ECI and the European Parliament office in Greece. And we apply transdisciplinary knowledge drawn from political science, communication, digital arts, and media science to enhance an educated common European citizen identity. I will skip the specifics. Perhaps I can do so while answering questions. Let me just say that citizen literacy in its metaphysical simplicity, it just seeks tolerance and enhanced democracy to reinforce practices that do not directly aim at one's self-interest, but instead these practices rely on the understanding of a homo universalis so much needed during this current crisis, and so well based on what we've come to learn in the Western civilization, and in this corner of the Western civilization, Greece, what we have learned from our wisest of philosophers. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, what a rich introduction by both of you. And I'd like to turn to a question, but also remind our listeners and viewers that you can offer questions through the Q&A function, and then we can share the questions with our speakers. So don't hesitate to introduce your own questions so we can have a dialogue with them. But I'd like to start just by pivoting off something that both of you said that I think really speaks to the overlap in the Venn diagram between your very diverse disciplinary spaces. And that's, again, a general question about how you see this, the inflection point of the COVID-19 crisis when it comes to appreciation for cultural heritage as world heritage and our shared humanity. Because Bonnie, you spoke a lot about the importance of intergenerational transmission and placing people in time over generation. And you also talked about the importance of cultural heritage in its possibility to unite people, whether locally or globally. And then Mario, you talked again about diversity at the local level and universality at the global level. So I wonder, just from each of your perspectives, whether you think the COVID-19 inflection point is making people more aware of all of those positives that you discussed that make us more human and make the local more connected to the global, or whether indeed we may be seeing the opposite or some of both. So Bonnie, why don't I start with you, and then Mario, we'll go back to you.
Sure. Thanks for the question, and thanks for the opening remarks, Mario. It's good to hear a very different perspective in the interdisciplinary approach to the topic, which is, I think, a great advantage of this series. In my mind, the COVID-19 has been produced both, as Mario said, threats and opportunities. The threats resemble very much those, or some of those, that are raised by armed conflict, and they're more on a practical note. Things like health risk can prevent staffers or guards from securing sites in the same way they normally would. Museums can't attract visitors, which puts them economically at risk, or resources are diverted from cultural heritage preservation to other needs, such as public health. At the same time, as you mentioned, Elizabeth, there are some opportunities, which I do think go to the idea of spreading knowledge about cultural heritage universally. So first of all, museums and others have use the time of closure during the pandemic to digitize their collections, and many have had free access to resources online, whether it's videos of tours of their museums or access to their archives or whatever. And I think that leads to greater awareness of cultural heritage around the world, but also and access to people who can't actually visit a site in normal times. And greater awareness in turn, of course, leads to greater protection. Secondly, the pandemic has shown in general the need for a global response to global problems. So it sets a model that could be used for protecting cultural heritage down the road. And finally, as I indicated earlier, crises and cultural heritage can bring people together. There are many examples of people united in armed conflict, during times of armed conflict to protect cultural heritage, or times when after conflict where they've worked to rebuild. So hopefully the same will happen with regarding cultural heritage in this current time of crisis.
Thank you. Mario, do you want to follow?
Sure. I think the most important thing is that we all, on the planetary level, realize how vulnerable we are, and this changes our perspective about just anything. The examples that I mentioned, like, for example, European level policies in the pandemic and moving funds around Europe and agreeing very quickly on issues that we would have never thought possible, like allocating great amounts of money around Europe in order to fight a common problem. This is all unique, and it's a very cultural thing, and I believe it's going to be very reinforcing to future policy making in Europe. This is a very new thing in Europe. We would spend very long periods of time to decide over just about anything, more or less important issues, and even decide on policies that would be in effect after a very long time, which would make them totally ineffective at the end of the line. So it looks like Europe has learned from this vulnerability aspect of the problem. And this is only part of the picture. And another interesting aspect is how we've all come to appreciate the pre-COVID-19 times. Of course, I'm talking about our developed democracies and about the Western world, but still, everybody's striving towards a better everyday life, but it's not until something as serious hits us all as this pandemic, that we realize that we wish we were to, like 4 or 6 months ago, and how great it was. So between the vulnerability and the appreciation of lost paradise, I believe we will never be the same.
Can I ask you to both of you to follow up a little, because whether it's thinking about the pre-COVID period as a positive period, I'd like to push a little bit on that when it comes to heritage protection. And also, Bonnie, your point about COVID, as how we've responded to the pandemic as a potential model for protection of cultural heritage. And I wonder if, as the COVID-19 conditions have made us aware that the pre-COVID period really wasn't so much of a paradise after all, and particularly in terms of our capacity to respond locally and globally, but also in terms of the question of compliance. We found it very difficult to make people comply, or to encourage people to comply with measures that would protect both themselves but also those around them in the pandemic. This has become, globally a source of tension within societies and then across societies. And I wonder on this question of compliance, particularly in conditions of armed conflict, but even now, in spaces where there is no armed conflict, if you could say a little bit about the compliance challenge, Bonnie, when it comes to getting states and communities to comply with their obligations under international law for protecting cultural heritage, and by extension, the sustainability of vulnerable communities that are part of larger communities. And then I'll flip over to you, Mario, with the same.
Mm.
Well, Thanks, Elizabeth. So with regard to the compliance issue, certainly, I mean, compliance is always a challenge. Compliance with international law or other local laws is always a challenge during armed conflict. It's a time of chaos. It has its own, it has, like, human rights law applies at all times. International humanitarian law, the law of war, applies just during the times of conflict. So there's efforts to bring some order to a time of chaos legally, but you still have to get people to comply. I mean, I think on that compliance can take various forms. It can, or the threats can take various forms in terms of, you know, states disregarding the laws or non-state actors intentionally violating the laws. And that's true with cultural heritage destruction, whether it's, you know, ISIS destroying Palmyra for political reasons. It can be questions of, you know, maybe more compliant countries or militaries, but still cultural heritage gets caught in the crossfire. So those are challenges that we need to deal with in conflict and other crises. That said, I think there's also inspirational examples of on a more local level of people pulling together, as I mentioned, to protect cultural heritage. And just as there are with COVID, if people, you know, you read in the news stories of lack of compliance, but you also read stories of feel-good stories about people doing the right thing and helping each other out in these times. I mean, one example that I like to give in my class is in Mali, in the Timbuktu, when Islamists took the city over. There was a great coordinated effort among the local citizens to secret the invaluable manuscripts from the libraries in Timbuktu out to safer places. And there was some international assistance, but it was mostly a grassroots movement. And I think those kind of local individual efforts, individuals working together, can be really advanced. And I think that's what we need during the pandemic as well, not just state compliance, but also local initiative.
All right, wonderful. Mario, if I can ask you to follow up.
All right. From my perspective, compliance is mainly a communication issue. One that was served wonderfully, and I believe that does have a cultural ring to it, a cultural aspect, prominent cultural aspect, very well served in Greece, where a very specific person, a member of academia, was chosen to communicate compliance to the Greek citizens. And it worked very, very nicely. No one thought that the Greeks would be able to coordinate themselves so well and comply to what was necessary to avoid the pandemic. What you had was someone who worked very well on many levels, did not challenge citizens or did not violate their dignity by, for example, trying to impose very strict policies. Instead, he talked to citizens every day, 6 o'clock, from mainly television media, also through new media, and was convincing enough to be effective. On the other hand, bringing cultural heritage into the picture, what I mentioned earlier, the example of the lighting of the Olympic flame is a very good example. Imagine, as you know, the Olympics this year have been postponed. We'll have them next year. We've been working towards a very simple concept. We think that the lighting of the flame, which, according to history, it was the ideal opportunity for a global truce during the Olympic Games, can now acquire a totally new meaning. We've been working with a group of scientists that have come up with a very interesting experience. They have revived a young girl by the name of Myrtis, who died during a pandemic 2,500 years ago. They worked on the findings, on the remains, in order to create a model of this person that is, I can share with you perhaps later on. A picture is very lifelike, bigger than life actually. And we suggest that this young girl who's revived 2,500 years from a pandemic, a major pandemic that hit Greece, ancient Greece, during the Peloponnesian War, can now serve as an ambassador of goodwill to the Olympic Games, as an ambassador of values that will keep us safe and make us regard the future in a more optimistic way?
I want to come back to the issue of truce and throw that ball back at Bonnie in a moment. But before I do that, I also want to be respectful of our viewers. And we have a question for both of you. So let me read it and give you each an opportunity to respond. One of our listeners, viewers says, with famous cultural heritage spaces like museums, monuments, castles, etc., adapting to the problems of COVID-19 by restricting the number of people or the time for access, is there an ethical issue? How do you see the ethical issue of individual access to such spaces being answered in the near future, given that access is already restricted in many ways to a select few in the world population, but maybe further restricted due to public health concerns? So access, the ethics of access to cultural heritage spaces, and how we can share access if we can't have it physically.
May I?
Sure, yeah.
Just as we did with other aspects of social life, this needs to be replaced by technology, most probably. In other words, if you restrict access to spaces, cultural spaces, then technology has to move in and has to make those spaces more accessible in some other way. On the one hand, there was no choice about it. You couldn't have the crowds, for example, in the Acropolis museums like you did. But on the other hand, closing them down was, I still don't understand why. And Acropolis itself is an open space. And you could have very specific ways to make sure that public safety was served. Of course, it's open now, but I know many other similar places of the world that are still closed.
Bonnie, do you want to follow up on the access point and the ethics,
Sure.
the ethics of access as well? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it's sort of a practical issue and an ethical issue, I guess. The ethics of access is always something to keep in mind, particularly in some of the work I do. I'm not sure, given that there's a public health necessity restricting the access now, I don't necessarily see that raising a major ethical issue at the moment. But I do think there needs to be, to counterbalance that, there needs to be efforts to increase access to others. So it reminds me very much of another project I've done, not related to cultural heritage, but the analogy is there, related to diplomacy. At the UN, there's a lot of debates about digital diplomacy and the effectiveness of in-person versus digital accessibility. And on the one hand, obviously face-to-face provides more opportunities. The same with cultural heritage. You get to see and experience a work face-to-face, just like you can talk to diplomats in the hallway or whatever. But at the same time, digital technology allows us to reach a much wider audience. So in the diplomatic sense, victims of conflicts who may not otherwise be able to make it to Geneva, either due to visas or costs, can participate in meetings. And similarly, people today can, not maybe the same, but they at least can virtually tour museums or visit sites. So I think in order to balance the access out, I think it's important for museums or libraries or whatever cultural sites to maintain their safety with, limited visitors, but at the same time make efforts to create free access to and spread that access internationally to a wider audience. So there are potentially some benefits, and hopefully benefits that will extend beyond the pandemic, so that kind of access can be balanced out more over time. Of course, there's challenges with not everyone having equal access to technology, which is a related issue, but not exactly the same thing.
One more thing here.
One
more thing. It will be nice to see in the future hybrid technologies stepping in. For example, think of the kind of tours that could be made available globally if we had drones making live tours over cities like Athens to worldwide cultural heritage spaces, bringing together also the audiences interested in real time. I'm not talking about audiovisual productions here. I'm talking about having drones to offer live tours.
Also, in both of your experiences, Mario, what you've described seems both exciting and possible. In your experience, is there a discussion about these sorts of things happening? And then Bonnie, going back to you, in terms of the use of technology, can you maybe say a little bit about the application of particular kinds of digital technologies for example, for forensics research and recording related to both testimonies, but also memorializing cultural heritage sites that may be destroyed in terms of armed conflict. So let's go back to you, Mario, with the imaginative and exciting possibility of the use of drones. Is anyone talking about this for real-time access?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
meaning that it's against a double-fold responsibility. The one is to develop both the ideas and the technology. We have a drone lab within ECI that does some of this work in this specific case. But, applying or developing technology or even coming up with an idea is only half the job. The other half is communicating it, and not communicating to societies, to citizens, but communicating it to those who create policies. We believe we're good in this, mainly because we serve communication, so we need to apply it as well. But this may prove to be the hardest part.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll look forward to a live tour over the Acropolis or somewhere else before the end of the pandemic. And
you'll be the first to know.
Yeah, okay. All right, great. Okay. How about Bonnie with technologies and the use of digital technologies, particularly in terms of, places of conflict? Can you say a little bit more about that?
Digital technology has become crucial for documenting human rights violations or violations of the laws of war over the past 10, 20 years. Certainly since I first began, visited Afghanistan in 2002, where it was essential that we be on the scene. And obviously it's still better to be on site, but in the cases of armed conflict, you often can't get access to the site, to the battleground or the sites you need to see. So human rights researchers have used technology, whether it's satellite photos and YouTube videos, which you can cross-reference in various technological ways to ensure that an attack is actually the weapon you think it is. You can find mass graves. You can interview victims long distance. There's a whole range of valuable technology that can help document human rights abuses and could similarly be used to document and monitor the state of cultural heritage today. So for example, I've seen satellite photos a while ago, or aerial photos at least, of looting sites where you can see all the different holes. Now you need to get there, you still have to figure out how to protect it, but at least you can monitor threats as they approach. And so I think that's really useful, as well as getting testimony of people on the ground, witnesses who can report on what's going on. So I think that's useful in the cultural heritage context, both for raising flags about when action needs to be taken, and then also down the road for holding people accountable. If you gain that evidence, you can lead to criminal cases in either the International Criminal Court or other venues. And so technology is important for documenting that.
Can you offer a particular case? I mean, I know the UN is using a lot of forensic technology in the former caliphate spaces of Iraq and Syria under the control of ISIS to document human rights abuses. But can you tell us about a specific case or cases that you've worked on where technologies might have been especially important?
I don't know about the cultural heritage example, but in terms of conflict more generally, if that's
cultural heritage, if you have any cases that
I haven't done my own documentation of the cultural heritage issues, so I don't have a specific example I can offer.
But in terms of armed conflict more generally?
In conflict more generally, I mean, one thing I've done a lot of work on disarmament. So one issue I've worked on is incendiary weapons. So weapons like napalm, weapons that set fires and burn people. And that's been widely used in Syria by the Syrian government and the Syria-Russia coalition. But it's sometimes hard to distinguish, what a lot of bombs create fires. But so how do you just, every time there's a fire doesn't necessarily mean it's an incendiary weapon. So we've been using, as I say, YouTube videos or cell phone videos, satellite photos, etc., and and comparing them to determine, first of all, determine the accuracy and that this is all showing the same place and this isn't just someone posting a video from somewhere else. But then you can determine based on, either remains of the weapons that are there or the effects that you witness, how they explode, all that kind of stuff can determine what kind of weapon it is, not just incendiary, but even the specific type of incendiary weapon. And then meanwhile, you can communicate with the people on the ground to get testimony about, number of victims or, talk to the first responders and so forth. So all those tools have then bolstered our advocacy in the UN for stronger law on this topic. So as I say, it's not a cultural heritage example, but I think the analogy could be used. It could be a tool that could be used for cultural heritage protection and create stronger law there, ideally. Yeah.
And do you, and Mario, how about you? Do you see, analogies similar to those that Bonnie described? Or do you see, you talked at the beginning in your introduction about already some, innovations that are being developed when it comes to heritage protection, preservation. Do you have any particular, you gave the case of the Olympic flame. Are there other cases that you've seen unfold or unfolding during the pandemic that relate to digital technologies and access to sites or protection of sites, or to intangible practices, it may be, not just, tangible cultural heritage?
Let me reflect for a moment here, along with everyone else who's participating today, on what happens at Hagia Sophia, which is very, very interesting because you have a global monument here, and you have a symbol that brings together different cultures and different nations, in the sense that everybody had access to this monument, and everyone could use it as a prayer space, changing completely. And this gives us reasons to research attitudes, both a priori if we had the time, but unfortunately we don't, because this is going to be official. We're going to have a prayer in there on the 24th of July, but at least we can do this a posteriori. I would like to see, I don't know if the Turkish government will make it available, I would like to see a little bit from what will happen inside the building. For example, how they will cover up Christianity symbols, and how they will, they have mentioned that they're going to play around with lighting, but lighting can be very disastrous for paintings and so on. Therefore, I would both like to see technology stepping in and becoming a witness to this rapid change of a world-level cultural heritage museum, space, rather say, and also research reactions coming from different groups of the world as well. Let me also mention here that I believe I saw just this morning a statistic coming from Turkey, from a prominent newspaper, saying that I remember the exact percentages, 44% of the inhabitants of Constantinople, Istanbul, are against this conversion, and 46 are for it, which is just 2% over this. Now, if you combine this information with a hype, let's say with a reinforced hype by the Turkish government, to put it mildly, then the real percentage can be very much towards preserving what Hagia Sophia stands for and not what it's becoming.
All right, this is great. Your discussion about the decision in Turkey with Hagia Sophia, first a Byzantine Christian cathedral, then a mosque, then a museum, now back to a museum, and a World Heritage site raises, again, the issue of compliance, because, the United Nations has UNESCO has raised serious concerns and objections to the decision to reactivate the site as a mosque. And we have a question here, and I want to remind our viewers to populate the Q&A with your questions. But we have a question that, again, speaks to the compliance and enforcement dimensions that are part of the Hagia Sophia case, but more broadly. Bonnie, this is for you directly. The question the viewer asks, can you speak about the enforcement power of international legal institutions to ensure the protection and preservation of cultural heritage. In the absence of strong legal authority in this field, some scholars, such as Alessandro Cecchi, have called for the establishment of an international cultural heritage court. Do you see this as something that may develop in the future? And if so, what are its possible implications?
Thank you for the question, and thank you to the audience for chiming in with some questions. It's great to get everyone engaged. I think, well, international law is always a challenge with compliance. It's harder to enforce in some ways than domestic law. That said, I think it serves a very important purpose, or multiple important purposes. But so I think with cultural heritage, there are many weaknesses in international law. I mentioned earlier the differences in definitions alone creates gaps, and there's definitely rooms for strength. So the first step would be to strengthen the treaties themselves, whether it's through new treaties or amending old treaties, to create the strongest norms possible. The second step is that international law, often a common tool of enforcement is actually not so much the courts, but stigma. And that's been shown in many cases that even countries that haven't joined a treaty often comply with them because there's this international condemnation of whatever, whether it's a prohibited weapon or prohibited action under the laws of war. There's so much stigma against doing certain activities that it can enforce itself in that way. The third prong, which goes specifically to the question, is obviously judicial enforcement. I hadn't heard about the idea of an international cultural heritage court. It sounds like a wonderful idea. I don't know how realistic it would be right now, given how long it took them to get an international criminal court, but I like the idea. And it could be sometimes international criminal prosecution can occur through hybrids, whether it's either like a combination international domestic criminal court to try war crimes, or even just domestic tribunals. But I think in the meantime, we can, it would be great if the existing courts, such as the International Criminal Court, step up more. And there was some progress a few years ago where in the past, when they brought cases relating to cultural heritage, they'd always been attached to other crimes. So it might have been various crimes of ethnic cleansing or genocide, and then one of many crimes was cultural heritage destruction. The Almaty case, which related to destruction of cultural heritage in Timbuktu, focused on cultural heritage destruction, and that was a huge step forward in the sense it gave it its own weight. That said, there's been debate about whether the decision went far enough, and concern about this sort of hierarchy of crimes. Like it's a challenge. You don't necessarily want to say a building's worth more than a life, but should it be that much less? And that to be important to sort of even out that hierarchy more. And that goes a little bit to the quote I concluded my opening remarks with about Mostar, and the Bridget Mostar, and how, in that particular writer's opinion, it resonated as much or more than the loss of an individual human life, this loss of a culture, because it has so much universal appeal. So I'm not trying to outweigh human life by any means, but I do think the hierarchy needs to be more even, and cultural heritage crimes need to be, the law and the prosecution of damage to cultural heritage needs to be strengthened.
Yeah, well, the ICC, as you said, took so long
right.
to establish, and also many countries, including the U.S., don't acknowledge its authority. So, but at least in terms of its symbolic value, it's significant.
I would one other comment is just that I get a lot of people, saying, well, international law is worthless because people violate it. Certainly we see that all the time. But one analogy I like to use is that people murder each other all the time, unfortunately. But that doesn't mean we wouldn't want laws against murder. It still serves as, or any other crime, it still serves as a deterrent and example of norm setting and social norm setting. So I think law is still important, even if it's not a panacea to all of these problems.
Yeah, and thank you for the analogy. It's a great one. Mario, any follow-up on that, the idea of an international cultural heritage court?
Yes, certainly. Actually, Elizabeth, would you mind if I passed my turn for a second to Francois, who would like to comment on this, and then get back to me?
Sure.
I think I saw his name somewhere, Francois.
I don't know. I don't see a Q&A. I don't see anything in the queue in the.
No? All right. Then I'll continue.
Okay.
Well, I'd say that we need something even more efficient, something like a UNESCO task force to get involved. Not just Alessandro Cecchi's suggestion for a cultural heritage court. ICC has not been effective. The International Criminal Court has not been effective because it's a referee between different views and perspectives, but everyone agrees on what cultural heritage is. And even opposing powers can agree on what they don't want to see destroyed during their conflict. So it would be much easier to have such a court, or even have a task force, or even a police, a UNESCO police, or some kind of a cultural army, let's say, that would be would have an agenda of protecting cultural heritage.
Well, given the state of multilateral institutions, let's see where this may take us. And I want to again remind people to please feel free to submit questions. Until I see another one, I actually have a follow-up question for both of you. I wonder if you can say a little bit about who you think are the key stakeholders when it comes to the present and future of cultural heritage protection, and in particular the sustainability of local communities that are connected to heritage, both tangible and intangible. From your perspective, each of your perspective, who are the main stakeholders? Who are the key states or multilateral and international organizations? Who are the key non-state actors? Is it, religious and faith communities? Is it, ethno-linguistic communities, other identity communities? Who are the stakeholders, and who's doing a good job and who's doing a less good job right now, or who needs to do better? Mario, why don't I throw that to you first?
All right. The two main stakeholders, or those who could make the change, could make the difference, is on the one hand, as I always say, academia, and I'll get back to that, and the other is the Council of Europe in our case, meaning that the culture ministers around Europe could very well sit on one table and decide common policy that would affect the greater area, all the way to Israel. We have so many people involved in what we call the Eurovision contest, which is a song contest, and yet we don't have something similar to promote the need, for example, for protection of our cultural heritage. And it only takes 28 ministers to sit on one table and just give incentives, the same way that they give incentives, for example, for the Erasmus Mundus student program, to facilities, to other stakeholders, and of course academia, to draw policies, give them a framework, and also give them very little money, doesn't take a lot of funding, to produce these policies. You just need a framework. We've seen other good things coming out of this approach within Europe. Maybe it's a good time to look at this.
Do you see any possibility, any buzz on this kind of a conversation? Or again, within the context of the Council of Europe, for example, might there be a tendency to say, these are soft issues, they're not existential issues, and yet I think, as both of you have, eloquently made clear, these are existential issues for local communities, but all of humanity. So do you see any, or do you hear any indications of this kind of a conversation in the council?
One sign, well, let's say that it's a very good, the timing is great, because the Hagia Sophia issue could provoke such a formation. I personally hope that this will not just wither away as an issue, that will stay there. Remember that we have statements from the Pope, statements from the Patriarch, statements from leaders of states. Therefore, the timing is great to create a mechanism that would deal with these issues in the future. Therefore, once again, I'm an optimist.
Okay, all right. So you're an optimist, it sounds like. Okay.
Yes.
Let me go to Bonnie and ask you, stakeholders, who's doing a good, who must be a stakeholder, who's doing a good job, who needs to do better?
Well, I was thinking this through, and I sort of see four categories of stakeholders. I think it's hard to say, there's so many different situations around the world to say, identify more specific case holders without looking at a specific case. But I think the first is at the level of the state, the countries, and particularly in my field of expertise in the military. I think it's important. States obviously have to comply with the laws, but they also need to inculcate in the military is the importance of protection of cultural heritage. And that can be a matter of training and setting, rules of engagement and so forth. And some of the issue is, intentional failure to comply, and some of it's just ignorance or, failure to be aware of what might have value. So in that sense, they need to cooperate or partner with other stakeholders such as academics or NGOs to learn about what a particular cultural context is and what heritage in that area is worth protecting. The second category I would say of stakeholders is the local community, and that, as you said, it could be faith groups, it could be ethnic groups, it could be all sorts of different things, depends what the main local community elements are in a specific area, but they need to be invested in their own cultural heritage and learn about it, be aware of it, and take steps to protect it. The third category I would say would be like NGOs, non-governmental organizations, who can help document violations, can also step in and provide assistance with protection, those kind of expertise and so forth. And the fourth, I think, as Mario said, is academics and other experts whose role is to inform the public and all the other stakeholders I mentioned about the value of cultural heritage. And I think they play a really important role as well.
Can I ask you both on the academic side, since you both live in the academy, and other spaces as well, but your homes are in the academy. From your particular, areas of expertise and disciplinary spaces and professional spaces in the academy, what's your, again, this is a general question, but what's your overall assessment of how seriously the academy understands the significance of cultural heritage in terms of contemporary international peace and conflict, or whether or not there's a general perspective in the academy that cultural heritage is something that, museum experts do or classicists do? Do you see, perhaps the answer is an implicit yes, given that you're both here speaking with us, but more generally, do you see that there's an acknowledgement within the academic space of the significance of cultural heritage as an issue for international peace and order? Let me start with you, Bonnie, and then we'll go back to Mario.
Well, I think it may depend. Academia itself is a broad category, so I think it may depend, and it's hard to generalize.
Right.
Obviously art historians and archaeologists, certainly value and understand the details of cultural heritage. I don't feel like I can speak authoritatively to the whole legal field. I know primarily Harvard's, but I think based on what I've heard from students, there hasn't been as much in the law school field about cultural heritage. So I'm not saying, there are definitely examples of people in the legal world that are academics that are working on this issue. So I don't want to say it's not happening altogether, but at least students I've talked to, I teach a class on armed conflict and world heritage, and students have said they haven't been able to get that elsewhere. So I think, there are definitely schools that have such programs, but it's not maybe as widespread as it could be. And, I teach it as a reading group. I hope someday to expand into a fuller course, but, that's, pretty limited offering. And when I was in law school years ago, they had an art law course, of which this was one part of it, but there's a lot of factors with art law. So I think there probably could be more done on the legal side, and there's certainly good role models out there. So.
Yeah, that's great. And in the humanities, we see an appreciation, but in, international relations, the social sciences, and maybe in the communication sciences, Mario, you can tell us a little bit more about that. And certainly in terms of the in terms of law schools and other professional schools? How about from the communication science space, Mario? What's your assessment, kind of a read?
We have a very important part to play here. You see, in academia in Greece, you have very active and very valuable, for example, archaeology or art departments that are doing a great job that no one has heard of. At the same time, central administration, both the previous one and the current one, all realize the value of rebranding of Greece based on its cultural heritage, moving away from the excellent cuisine and the brilliant seashore sites, and moving on to what does Greece and its legacy, its cultural legacy, really stand for, and making it more accessible to everyone. We're talking about designing campaigns that are heading themselves towards the layman, towards the broad populations of Europe, and not just Europe, the whole world. By the way, I have to say that we see more and more Americans and Germans appreciating Greek heritage, as witnessed by tickets sold at the museums. So apparently something has been done to attract more American and more German visitors in our archaeological sites. The same has to apply to everyone else, but this is not just a Greek issue. Once again, cultural heritage concerns everyone. If everybody realizes what the current couple of central administrations have done in Greece, we can all benefit from it. In other words, talk a little bit more about where you come from. The states have done this very efficiently through their popular culture. I mean, this is a very young country, the United States, yet they have so much to say over the last few hundred years. There's a lot to learn from this. And of course, there's a lot to learn from the science of digital storytelling. Once again, it's on the shoulders of communication scientists to act as in-betweens from academia to policymakers in order to, talking about Homo Universalis, not just discuss our individual cultures, but also find the common ground among them.
All right, wonderful. I love that, Homo Universalis. Okay. We have time for one last question. We actually have two, but they're both related. So I'm going to combine them. And they're for both of you, and they both have to do with governments. One of our listeners, emphasizes the importance of governments as the most important stakeholder for preserving cultural heritage, particularly when wars break out and cultural monuments become targets. So, and in a world of territorialized states, the centrality of governments, what can be done to reinforce government capacity? And on a related note, with populist governments using cultural heritage and monuments as symbols to solidify their power in an exclusivist fashion, again, what can be done when it comes to addressing how governments either protect or instrumentalize cultural heritage? And the threat of delisting maybe a World Heritage site that's in a particular state, is that a toothless threat, or is that something that maybe governments may get governments to respond more effectively? So what can governments do? What should they do? And how do we make them do better? We have a few minutes before we close, so I'd ask you to just sort of sum up on that point. Bonnie, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thanks. And again, it's great to get some questions from the audience. I think on the government front, some of it is that it needs to be, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but a two-way street. So I think the government, and in the case of conflict, I put the military with that, needs to be open to feedback. They need to reach out to experts when they're operating in a specific battle space, to make sure that they understand what they're going to encounter and take the appropriate steps, so that they know how to protect something, but they also know what to protect. So that could be everything from, establishing a no-strike list of what they're allowed to attack, but also being prepared for, as protecting museums or protecting archaeological sites after a battle. So it's not just at the time of a battle, it's also the whole period around it. At the same time, I think experts and academics that we talked about need to be proactive in reaching out to governments and military. So they need to listen, but the experts need to reach out and make sure they are properly informed. So it's very, and they need to in turn understand military needs in the sense that, you know, I mean, the idea of military necessity can often be abused, but there are certain tactical possibilities that they need to understand so they can adapt their recommendations accordingly. And there are rare examples and very important examples of individuals who, you know, have art historical or archaeological backgrounds who've been in the military and have done very impressive efforts to protect cultural heritage. So those are but sometimes you don't always get it in one person. So you have to bring those two groups together. And then the third group I bring in is other states, other parties that aren't party to the conflict. There's definitely a precedent in international humanitarian law and human rights law, disarmament law, of the importance of international assistance and cooperation. And I think that can be as simple as exchanging best practices for how they've offered protections in the past or how they've recorded damage in the past. But also it can be financial assistance. We've argued in many other contexts that all states should be able to provide some form of assistance, because assistance can come in so many ways. It can be simply expertise, but it could also be, you know, deep financial resources. So I think that it's important for the international community that's not involved in the conflict to participate as well.
All right, wonderful. I like in particular the best practices and different forms of assistance that states can provide to build capacity. So Mario, how about you on this issue of governments?
I would like to go back to what you said about the populists handling of this issue of national identity or pure national identity, which is usually seated on cultural heritage, and you're right about this. But this is a travesty per se. I can talk to you about Greek extreme right and how it uses certain stereotypes from the ancient world and the ancient cultural heritage. And this is an hybrid approach in itself, because they proclaim themselves both as Christians and as lovers of the 12-god pantheon. What we should all realize, and of course they need to realize this first, and perhaps we need to be tolerant towards their incapacity to realize, is that there is no pure cultural heritage unless we're talking about one that is based on language. I can talk about Greece, and we all know that the Greek civilization, which of course is based on a common language that has evolved through the years and still keeps us together, is based on the infusion of many different cultures all the way to this day. And let's not forget that the Greeks have always been travelers, have always used the sea. Actually, there's one neuroscientist that proclaims that the way of a Greek man's thinking has to do with the openness of the sea and the non-linearity of a river culture. It's a very interesting point. What I'm saying here is that there is so much infusion of other cultures within the Greek cultural heritage that it seems very funny to say, based on facts and based on history, that there is something as pure Hellenic cultural heritage unless you base it on the Greek language, because there you have a very, very strong bond. Now, those populists need to be discouraged, and of course they need to redefine themselves more efficiently, because they are a hybrid per se. No one needs to say no more on this.
All right, okay. Thank you. And thank you to both of you. We're at the end of our time altogether. I want to thank you both for launching this series and for helping us to think about cultural heritage as world heritage within the context of the current inflection point of COVID-19. We are all interconnected locally and globally. I love that you came from very different disciplinary and professional vantage points, helping us all to begin to reflect on cultural heritage from our own locations. So thank you for your time. Thank you to everyone here who was online viewing. Thank you to Brad. Thank you to Francois and to Cece. And also, I want to remind people that the next session will be on July 16th at noontime, and that's going to be on private partnerships, social impact investing, and cultural heritage. So I invite you all to come for that. That will be moderated by Mr. Lukas Katsonis, president of the Foreign Affairs Institute in Greece, and thank you to him, and also to Reverend Dr. Vasilios Bekas from the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens for being part of the organizing committee with all of us. So thank you for this session, and thank you to all of you who were part of this. And let's hope that the next time we have our conversation, a lot of the ideas you've put out there will have moved at least forward, if not been implemented. So thank you, and I wish you all good health and a good day.
Same to you and everyone else.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.